Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, the election is unfolding, but it's not the only priority we should be focused on. On this show, we're always talking about the intersection of politics and national security, and there's never been a week where that is happening in more full bloom than right now. So I am very happy to be bringing on the show really the perfect guest for this moment, a man I admire tremendously and have known for a long time, the great and powerful Tom Bowman is on Independent Americans. Welcome, sir.
Hey, Paul, great to be with you.
So, man, I don't know when we first got in touch, but it's been a long time, right?
It's been a number of years, yeah.
It might have been like when I first came home from Iraq. I mean, maybe over 15 years ago.
I think that's probably right. You know, I was in Iraq 2006, 7, and 8, spent a lot of time with Marines and the Army. And then 2008 started going to this place called Afghanistan and spent a month or two there every year right up until, God, 2017, 18.
Well, you've been all over the world in the hot zones, but you've been focused on, I think, the most important national security stories for, at least since I've been home for 20 years or so. So it's a real honor to have you on the program. I want to talk about The Good Guy, your new podcast that kicks off this week on NPR. I want to talk about the bigger January 6th discussion. There's breaking news about General John Kelly, breaking news about North Korean troops in Ukraine. But let's reset and start with the question I ask everybody, Tom. Where are you and how are you in these trying times?
I'm physically at NPR headquarters in Washington, and I'm doing fine. It's busy. I'm following the North Korean story today as well. There's always something going on, as you know, in the national security realm. We keep very, very busy. Let's just say that.
I want to just take a minute to share with folks. If you've never been to the NPR headquarters in Washington, D.C., and you go to Washington, D.C., I highly recommend it. I mean, it's really like a living museum and a testament to the great work that NPR does. And I think especially around the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, really everything since post 9/11, you and your team at NPR have been at the forefront. You, Quill Lawrence, so many others. I think you all have done some of the best reporting and the most important reporting. It's been a true public service. So I want to thank you for that and tell people, great gift shop, really cool building. Go check it out if you're in DC, right, Tom?
Well, unfortunately, the gift shop is no longer there.
Oh, no.
It was a victim of the pandemic. But what is still here, I'm not sure if you've ever seen it, Paul, is we have this little kind of memorial to David Gilkey and Zabi Tamana. We were in an ambush back in 2016. David Gilkey, famous photographer, Zabi, wonderful guy, an interpreter and fellow journalist. And we have a big portrait of them to talk about who they are. And we also have one of David's cameras, which is kind of all scorched because we were in an ambush and they were killed. They were hit by a RPG, and, we think of them really every day.
I think it's a really important part of the conflicts of the last 20 years that don't get enough attention or focus. I was recently with Craig Renaud, who lost his brother, and my friend Brent Renaud in Ukraine. We've had Sebastian Younger on the show. We've had so many. Dan Lamothe has been a regular. So it's great to finally have your viewpoint. Can I ask you, I want to get into all the issues, but you're so experienced and you've kind of seen it all. Can you talk about what it's like to cover these issues at the intersection of the presidential election? Is it hard to get stories on? Is it hard to get people to focus on distant places when they're so deep in swing states and the latest crazy shit that Trump said?
It's not because Ukraine is still very much, front burner for us. How will both candidates handle that in national security issues, who's ever elected? We've seen what Trump has said about the military, suckers and losers. I got to tell you, there are some senior officers I know in the Pentagon that have actually had conversations with their wives that, if he gets in again, I'm not sure, I might just retire. So there's a real concern about what he will do with the Pentagon. And also the big thing people I talk with is using the National Guard and maybe the active duty military to basically track down illegal migrants and put them in camps. One recently retired senior officer said, that could break the military. You could have, for example, a lot of Hispanic soldiers who say, you know what, I don't want to be a part of this. And Paul, there's actually precedent for this. Back in 1968, at then Fort Hood, 5 dozen Black soldiers refused to go to the Chicago Convention for riot control. They said, we don't want to go back to our own neighborhoods and police our own friends, our own people. They were all court-martialed. They refused to go. I didn't know about it, and this National Guard general told me about it, but it's an interesting story. So I think there's a lot of concern about what a Trump presidency will look like. And, with Harris as well, will she continue supporting Ukraine? What will the Pentagon look like under Harris? So, we get plenty of airtime on these issues, clearly at NPR. There's just a lot of concern about the way ahead.
You have your ear to the ground and so many people in the building. So it's so valuable to hear that perspective, because sometimes I think it gets billed as scaremongering. But what I was on CNN talking about it last night, I mean, you've got a situation where it is truly unprecedented. Opposing Trump is his former Secretary of Defense, his former National Security Advisor, his former Chief of Staff, former Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, right? I mean, you've got to go a long way to drive Dick Cheney out of the Republican endorsement. But there is now a divide that even goes down to a granular level where the Arlington Cemetery will release information this week about the clash between Trump and Arlington. So there is really a divide here that has accelerated, and he's openly said he doesn't want officers who are going to buck him. He wants loyalty. So that brain drain in the Pentagon, I think, is a real thing. I mean, you don't have to follow an unlawful order. But you can also just retire, which I think it sounds like we would see, given the consistent clashes he has with his generals. I want to maybe talk about Kelly if we can first. Because
can I just add one thing, Paul?
Please,
Frank McKenzie, the retired CENTCOM commander, 4-star Marine general, he wrote in his book that came out, I guess last year or earlier this year, that at the end of the Trump presidency, they sent some people over to the Pentagon to try to remove certain admirals and generals and put, quote unquote, their people in. And McKenzie writes that this was completely disruptive, politicizing the military. They were aghast at this. So they did try it last time. And a lot of people I talk with, active and retired, think they'll clearly try to do that again.
Well, and he sent a message clearly that he wants loyalty, right? He wants loyalty to him. And the clashes with Milley and everyone else are now, so well publicized. But I think with regard to Kelly, I'm one of the people who said we wanted to hear from him. We heard quotes from him, we heard anonymous sourcing, but you never actually heard him on the record speaking in his own voice. This new interview with the New York Times feels like that moment. I mean, I would prefer if he did a press conference, if he sat down with you and with 60 Minutes and others, so people could see him and hear him. But this seems to me like his moment to say, hey, I know it's 2 weeks out. I want to make sure the world understands where I stand in my own voice. But how do you see this moment with John Kelly, and given the historical context as well?
No, I think it's significant because John Kelly is a stellar guy, retired 4-star general, lost his son in Afghanistan. I mean, he is the real deal. And for someone like John Kelly, who's not political, of course, is a retired officer, you never really heard his political views. For him to come out and talk this way about Trump is significant. I mean, he was, his chief of staff. He saw him all the time. So I think he realizes that he's not the right kind of guy for the job. And I think a lot of people will listen to him. But what's interesting, of course, is the polls are very close. Trump is still doing quite well. The polls are neck and neck, right? So we'll see what happens. And it's interesting, the podcast we did on this Marine Sergeant Joshua Bate, he went up to the Capitol to hear Trump speak. They got there too late. He and 2 other Marines out of Marine Base Quantico got there too late. So they see this big crowd, they kind of join in and go up to the Capitol, and 7 minutes after the doors are breached, he's inside the Capitol walking around. So, and I said, what do you like about Trump? He said, well, he's really good for the military. No one's going to mess with him. We're not going to get into another war. And it's funny because I asked him, I said, well, you know what he said about suckers and losers? You know what he said about when he visited John Kelly's son's grave about what's in it for them? He said, no, I never heard that. And the reason is because all he watches is Fox News. All he gets his information from are these conservative websites, some of them really far out websites. So I think part of these stories when we're looking at the election is where do you get your information from? And I think media literacy is a problem for everyone in this country, everyone across the board. And, you can go to MSNBC and get a certain slant. You can go to obviously Fox and get another slant. But I think we as citizens, as voters, really have to dig in and spend the time finding out what's really going on. What are the facts? Not just what my opinion is or someone's opinion. I think that's a huge problem.
Your perspective is very rich here, Tom, and I want to come back to The Good Guy, your important new podcast. You're talking about Sergeant Joshua Abate, who participated in this. You talk about how almost 20% of the folks who participated in the insurrection were veterans, and you're going to unpack that. But I want to stay on Kelly for a second because I think he does have a potential to break through. And let me ask you this. You've probably talked to a lot of these guys off the record. You may or may not be able to even share that with me now. But do you think there's more coming from Kelly, or is this it? And are we going to hear from Mattis? Are we going to hear from anybody else in this next 2 weeks that we just have been waiting to hear from, that we've never heard from because the stakes are so high, because they know that their voice might influence a couple of thousand people in Pennsylvania or in other independents who are on the fence, who care about national security, and will listen to a general or an admiral? So do you think we'll hear more from Kelly and Mattis or anyone else?
It's possible we'll hear more from Kelly after the New York Times piece ran. He's getting all sorts of messages from people like, hey, can I talk with you? Would you like to come on this show? How about an interview for this magazine or this newspaper? So he's being inundated with calls. Will he come out and talk a little bit more? We'll have to see. Will Mattis come out? I mean, he's had certain things to say already about Trump. I haven't seen anything he said recently, so that's a question. Interestingly, Stan McChrystal came out and wrote, I guess, an op-ed piece, and also was on one of the network shows. And that kind of surprised me because I got to know him pretty well in Afghanistan. I never got the sense that he would even weigh in on politics of any kind. As far as Milley, I think he sees himself, he obviously is a retired military officer. I'm not sure if he sees it in his place to come out and talk about politics, politicians, who people should vote for. I think he sees Kelly and Mattis as different because they were both obviously 4-stars like him, but they also became political appointees. That's the difference you see.
Right. I'm going to pause for a second. I lost my light. I'm just going to turn it back on. We'll edit it out.
Sure.
My janky situation here, Tom. Hang on. Sorry. Maybe down for the count. All right. My light's a casualty. All right. We'll pick it right back up there, Tom.
That's good.
Yeah, so I think your point about Milley is important, but also Milley's kind of out there, right? Like, there's no secret what Milley thinks at this point. I feel like, I mean,
that's correct.
So out there, and now you've got this like last minute lining up of the guns, right? Tulsi Gabbard today decides she's going to be a Republican. You've got the Kelly stuff. There's this battle for attention, but that ecosystem of information, I do think, is really important. And so let's come back to your podcast, The Good Guy. 2 episodes dropping this week. Can I ask you, what do you think is the biggest takeaway here? Like, what's the macro? We're going to get it through the eyes of this one soldier who's important. I think it's also important for folks to understand, it was, 20% of the veterans participating, 20% of participants were veterans, but maybe 40% of the Capitol Hill cops are veterans. Who knows what percentage of the EMTs are veterans, right? They're not a monolith, but you would expect them to have... Sorry,
let me just stop you there. So 200 of the 200 folks, 1,500 arrested, 200 of them arrested were military veterans or active duty. So of that number, 200, roughly a little more than a third were Marine veterans or active duty, which is interesting, as you know, being an Army veteran. The Marines are the smallest fighting force, you see, but they're lopsided in the number of those who were arrested. So I found that really interesting.
Why do you think that is, Tom? I'm going to spare the joke. Why do you think that is?
It's funny. I spent a lot of time with Marines, great people, had just fascinating times with them in Iraq and Afghanistan. But as you know, being in the Army or those in other services, the Marines just tend to be different. I mean, they are the few, the proud. They're aggressive. They love telling you their story. They tend to be, and you hate to broad brush them, they tend to be a bit more traditional, maybe more conservative, right? You probably know that. And, they did not want to have women to serve in ground combat jobs. They were the last service they never really wanted that. They didn't think it was a good idea. And they thought that, it would break a lot of the really hard charging women joining the ranks of the infantry, how much weight they have to carry and so forth. And also they did not want to have gays serve openly as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
The Marine Corps
however,
definitely has, a unique subculture. And it tends to be slower with regard to the change. And Marines are always up for a fight, right? I mean, that's kind of like the
absolutely.
ethos too. So, I'm not surprised to see that, but I think, let me ask you maybe what I think is the most important part of this. Is another January 6th coming? Where are these guys now? The ones that didn't get arrested, the ones that still are here in this call. How do you rate this as a national security threat if Trump loses?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have talked to a couple of people who are involved in security for the Capitol for next January 6, 2025. And I'm told they are confident another January 6th cannot happen. Another insurrection cannot happen. They are very well prepared, a lot of plans, a lot of guard troops to be called on if need be. You could basically shut down the city. I'm told keep an eye on the state capitals
Yeah.
when the electors meet in December to count the votes, right? If there's going to be violence, they say, right, keep an eye on Harrisburg, right? Keep an eye on Lansing, Michigan, in all the state capitals, because you could see, some violence there if people
Yeah.
don't like the outcome and if they question the outcome. Also, I think it appears it's going to be really close if you look at the polls. And again, as we all know, the polls could be wrong. If it's not determined, the next day, right, November 6th, if it takes a couple of days, if it looks like one candidate is ahead and then the other is ahead, right, and then it kind of flips at the end, I think that could be really troublesome, depending particularly on what Trump says.
We covered this 4 years ago and predicted violence and said, what are we going to do if he doesn't go quietly? He didn't want to go quietly. And I think if you flip the table and look at it from, take the enemy's viewpoint, right? I mean, I would decentralize. I would hit state capitals. I would hit election headquarters, right? And then it feels like a fragmentation, and you're not going to hit the hardest target. You're going to look for other places to be disruptive. So
Right.
I've called it an American insurgency. It feels like they still take marching orders from Donald Trump. It's not unlike how Muqtada al-Sadr used to operate in Iraq at times, where you've got kind of a call to arms. Do you see this as an ongoing, I'll call it an insurgency, but what would you call it? It's a movement that's not dead. January 6th was a high point for them. There's still these elements out there. There could be other flashpoints, but politically, socially, militarily, how do you define these guys like Abate, who are still connected to this in some ways, even if he's not?
Right. I'm not sure if I call it an insurgency. It's clearly a different Republican Party. If you hear people like Liz Cheney talk about it, it's not the old-fashioned Republican Party we knew growing up. Low taxes, few regulations, a strong military. It's just different. You would never see Ronald Reagan say, let's just get out of Ukraine, and Putin's not a bad guy. So it really is a curious time. I don't know how. I'm still fascinated really with talking to more people who were at the Capitol on January 6th. I covered it that day. I covered the speech, went up to the Capitol. My colleague on the podcast, Lauren Hodges, she was in the mix, man. I mean, she was getting crushed with a colleague, Hannah Alam, who's now at the Washington Post. It was pretty touch and go for them for a while. So, again, I remember talking to a couple of military people up there because I try to use my street cred to get interviews. And I talked to this one Army officer, And I said, I was in Iraq and Afghanistan and I did this and that. He said, oh yeah, I was there and I was here. So kind of break the ice. I said, so why are you here? He said, I'm here to prevent socialism.
Hmm.
And I said,
Hmm.
you mean like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? He said, well, there are a couple of good things that have been done, right? And then I remember talking to this guy who's clearly a Proud Boy. They were in a stack, they had Kevlar and body armor, ready to walk in the Capitol. And I did the street cred thing again. Hey, I spent a lot of time in Iraq. He said, yeah, I did 2 tours with the 82nd. I said, do you have time to talk? He said, no, I don't give interviews. So, part of this is, I think the military, one of the things our podcast gets into, and it's interesting, is, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, the Marine Commandant we spoke with briefly, Eric Smith, they say, listen, we don't think we have an extremism problem. It's very small numbers of people, we have to, talk to, or maybe, call up on charges. We think it's very small. But here's the thing, Paul, they don't know.
They don't know. Yeah.
Because they don't keep data. So
Yeah.
finally this year, and this is in our podcast, finally this year, all the services have come out with guidelines. What is extremist behavior? What is prohibited behavior? And some of it's quite clear. You can't overthrow the government, but also you can't get involved in white nationalist groups, armed groups that want to go to Lansing, right, and attack the Capitol. And also, it's pretty hard hitting. You can't like something on social media that is clearly extreme. You can't wear, have bumper stickers or wear T-shirts. So it's really interesting what they've put out. But here's the
also,
thing.
Tom, important that this is recent. That didn't exist before. You could be in a white nationalist group and it was not formally prohibited by the military. All this kind of association was not codified in a way that would track and prevent and remove extremist behavior. So I think you're right in putting a point on it, saying they don't know. Now they can finally start to know and enforce and create accountability. But we've also had over 1 million people who've served since 9/11 who are out of the military. And
Right.
I will tell you, I think most of us in the veterans community think there is an extremist problem. And that's when they become more radicalized, whether it's by the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or someone else. And when I talk about an insurgency, I'm not talking about the Republican Party. I'm talking about a couple 100,000 people with guns who can organize to create violence in the furtherance of an objective of overthrowing or disrupting the government. That, to me, it fits more clearly into what we've traditionally called an insurgency. We're not talking about everybody, but it only takes a couple thousand people with guns to create some serious national security problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And where do they attack? Yeah, I think you're right. They hit the soft spots. They probably realize if we try to go to the Capitol again, if there are like 20 of us, we're going to be surrounded.
Look, I mean, I hate to keep pulling it apart, but one sniper team, and we've seen what can happen in DC with one sniper team, right? And the disruption and the fear, and that I think is a really critical element when we think about what happens next. Let me ask you, if I can, to go over to Ukraine, because that doesn't get enough attention. We focused on it a lot on this show. Lloyd Austin, in the last few hours, for the first time on the record, acknowledged that there are North Korean troops in the area. I don't know if he said Ukraine or not, but they acknowledge that they're there. Can you talk about what you know about that and this evolving situation where, when I look at it, I mean, this is, he said that there are North Korean troops in Russia. He hasn't said that they're necessarily in Ukraine yet, but this is how world wars start, right? So what do you know?
Absolutely.
What do you know about the situation right now there?
Well, I'm told by talking with sources that they expect roughly 3,000 to arrive in Russia. And I talked to someone today, a source who said, and we may hear more today about it, that they believe those troops are in eastern Russia, probably just got off a boat from North Korea, and likely would be heading, obviously, west. And apparently the North Koreans have promised up to 10,000 troops for Ukraine. Now, what we don't know is, are they infantry? Are they armor? Are they going to be advisors? Are they going to be in the front lines? So, and then if you look at, the hundreds of thousands of Russian troops, 600,000 casualties so far. So some people would say, well, what's 3,000 going to do? Or even 10,000? But the concern is North Korean troops in Europe fighting, right?
Yeah, and what it does is, And what it does is it gets North Korea into the war. If you can put Putin, if Putin can take a couple thousand and put them on the front lines and they get killed, he can go back to North Korea and say, hey, look, your boys just died in this fight. We need more. I mean, this is
Right.
exact. Putin wants to continue to expand it and pull in allies. And with Iran a little bit more preoccupied than they were a few weeks ago, North Korea seems like it's got plenty of fuel for the meat grinder that he wants to drag out for a long time. What do you think the Pentagon does here? I mean, is it just monitor and report as
Correct.
needed?
I think they'll just monitor, report as needed, probably try to talk with China. Maybe you guys go talk to North Korea saying that's not a good idea. We do know that North Koreans have already sent artillery shells to Ukraine, and a lot of them apparently are duds. And you know better than anybody, if you're going to North Korea to look for materiel, I mean, it's probably not a great idea, right? They're not exactly,
Yeah.
On the front line of technology.
Can I take you around the region just to a last point that we've covered on this show that I don't think many folks are covering in the national media, but there continue to be military engagements in places like Syria, Yemen, Iraq. We've got 2,500 troops or so in Iraq. Yesterday, the Pentagon admitted that a number of them were wounded. They weren't forthcoming. It was an answer to a question. Can you talk about these ongoing kind of below the radar engagements and casualties, right? Because this falls into the comment Trump made recently about, oh, they just got headaches, but we had close to 100 Purple Hearts. These injuries and casualties and engagements are happening out of sight of most Americans, and they're happening in 3, 4, maybe 5, 6 different countries. Can you talk about that?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, they are under threat in Iraq and Syria from mostly Iranian militia groups. Some are getting wounded, and they are firing back at ISIS, fighters too, mostly in Syria, but also the Iranian militia groups who are in Iraq. So yeah, 900 troops in Syria, in harm's way, 2,500 in Iraq. Now, there were some special ops people in Yemen. I'm not sure if they're still there or not, but yeah, I think it's a lot of people don't realize that the American troops are in harm's way, particularly in this region. And I don't see it ending anytime soon because ISIS is still a threat. They just hit, almost every week you hear them hit training camps or leadership cells. And again, there's a great concern in Iraq with these Iranian militias striking, shooting RPGs, or also at some of the bases up in Erbil, so forth. I mean, they're all under threat. And again, you're absolutely right. This is really just almost out of the public light. We try to talk about it every once in a while, but it's not like Iraq and Afghanistan. We had large numbers of troops there and people were focused on it. But this is also part of, there's no draft, as you know. So a lot of Americans are like, well, I don't really care much about it because my kid isn't going, and I know my daughter's not going to go, my kid's not going to go. So I really don't pay attention to it too much.
Yeah, I mean, it's the forever war. We talked about the authorized use of military force and how this is essentially an ongoing global war that most Americans don't see or even understand. But I think it's something that is especially important to keep an eye. It's one of the few reasons to stay on Twitter is that like Central Command and Joint Task Force Inherent Resolve, they'll put out statements and they'll say today we had an engagement with a ship at this time and this date, and we fired this, and you can actually keep track. And they are releasing this information. It's probably too slow and it's not very visible, but it's out there. Tom, you've generously offered to stick around for a couple of bonus questions. That'll be a lot more fun with our Patreon members. We're going to have Tom stick around for a couple more minutes. Thank you to our Patreon members for supporting. Let me ask you a last question, Tom, because I really respect your vision and your depth of understanding. What's next? What's the big national security or international security story that may be looming on the horizon that most Americans aren't thinking about that may be much more important in a couple of weeks or months from now?
Well, I think Ukraine continues to be really important. What's the way ahead there? I think next year you're going to see maybe some countries, particularly in Europe, start to saying, listen, we have to reach a deal here. So what does a deal look like? Does Ukraine have to give up some land to get peace? How much more armaments will also go into Ukraine, depending on who wins the presidency, right? Does Trump decide we're done? We're just going to bow to Putin and go with what he wants, which is basically what it was like before the war started, right? That's a big issue. Iran, what happens there with Israel? Clearly, they're going to strike Iran in the coming days or weeks. So, what does that look like? How hard do they hit? And what is Iran's response? And what do they do about building up their supposed nuclear weapon? Will they actually break out and try to and have a nuclear weapon? That has huge implications for the region, as we all know. And then China, China's still being pretty aggressive, harassing, military ships from Vietnam to the Philippines. That's going to continue. They'll probably get more aggressive. Military analysts say by 2027, that's coming up, they could have the capability of going into Taiwan militarily. So it's a lot out there, man.
Yeah, there's a lot on the horizon. We didn't even talk about the Arctic, which is something I'm going to continue to flag for people. We talked about with Admiral Stavridis and others on this show. There are plenty of flashpoints that could erupt that we haven't even discussed. But I think you took us really well around the horn here. It's baseball season. I got a last question for you before I thank you. You got a prediction on the World Series? Yankees, Dodgers. Do you have a prediction or a favorite?
I'm from Boston, Paul, so I think you know my favorite.
The Yankees. Then the Yankees must be your favorite. After the Knicks and the Celtics last night, we won't talk about basketball.
I was going to bring that up.
I figured you were.
Yeah. I didn't want to hit too hard. Yeah.
We're riding the Yankees right now, and it's been a fun ride. We got the Liberty having a parade right behind me tomorrow morning.
There you go.
That'll be fun. Sports is always a good way to bring us together and give us a diversion from all
of
it.
By the way, my son graduated from the University of Oregon, so go Ducks, if I can give that plug.
That is my 5-year-old's favorite college team.
Good to hear. Good to hear.
So he's a big Ducks fan. We got a lot of Ducks fans in this house. And they're fun.
You should go out there and look through the university, check out the grounds, and maybe, start saving your money and,
It's on my list. My little guy either wants to go there or college in Kansas City. He doesn't even know where, but he loves the Chiefs. And he just says, Dad, I want to go to college in Kansas City. So wherever they go, I hope that you will still be doing this work, because the work you do is a tremendous public service, not just to the veterans and military community, but to all Americans and to the world. You put yourself at great risk. You're constantly at great risk, especially in this kind of a political environment. But you're one of the best out there, Tom, and it's an honor to be in touch with you. I'm grateful for all your work, and it's a true honor to know you, sir. Thank you for all you do.
Thanks, Paul. Anytime.
All right, and thanks for coming on the show. Stay vigilant.